Okay, welcome to Chapter 10. If you recall, Chapter 10A is actually a PDF file. It's not physically printed in the book, and you can get that from supplemental materials. So let's go through the learning objectives on page 1 of the PDF. So we're going to learn about installing, using the graphical utilities, creating databases. We've done that. Understanding user-defined functions. Yeah, we kind of did that last time. The security model, yeah, we're going to talk an awful lot about that. And then the fundamentals of doing backup and restore operations. Okay, so on page 2, they start talking about the different editions, the Enterprise Edition and Standard Edition. So the distinction between these basically has to do with things like the core count and memory size and licensing. So for example, the Enterprise basically have a maximum number of CPUs allowed by the operating system, et cetera, et cetera. And the standard edition handles up to 4 CPUs, of course, and blah, 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 blah. And when you get down here, the Express edition, like the one we have, it's 1 CPU or 4 cores, and then maximum database size of and how much memory it's being used. Okay, so it's kind of sort of all about scaling and pricing. So if you're trying to do lots of stuff with lots of memory and lots of cores, it's going to go up the list here, and obviously the ones at the top of the list cost an awful lot more than the ones at the bottom of the list. In the old days, when you installed, it actually came bundled with the SQL Server Management Studio and with the reporting services. It all just came with it. That's not the case anymore. For some weird reason, I guess just because it got too big, during the install, it actually has a thing that says, hey, would you like to download the SQL Server Management Studio? Would you like to download reporting services? But it's not actually built into the installer itself. And since 2017, SQL Server has been a 64-bit only product. So that you don't have to worry about that because none of your machines are 32-bit. It now actually is available to run on Linux too. So it's not just a Windows product. It can actually run on Windows using a thing called containers. Don't worry about what that means. And so in addition to the normal ones you see here, there are some cloud-based ones. So take a minute to suck this in because it's kind of important. So there are basically 3 different types of cloud-based SQL Server. They call it Azure. That's the name of their cloud system. So the simple one is called an Azure SQL database. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It is a single database, okay? Not the whole server. You don't have an opportunity to mess with the server instance at all. You just have one database, okay? Good. And then there's one called an Azure SQL managed instance, which is kind of sort of like what we have, where we have the honest to God instance that belongs to us. We can have multiple databases, things like that. Okay, so an entire instance that belongs to us. And then the last one is the Azure SQL virtual machine, where you have the entire control. I mean, you can reboot the server. You can't reboot the server in the first one, on the database one, because all you have is a database. You can't reboot the server or do any type of thing on the managed instance, because again, that's just an instance. But if you go for the third one, well, you got everything. You can go reboot the machine, add accounts, do all sorts of things. On page 5, they start talking about installing. So there are some prerequisites. One of the prerequisites is a .NET Framework 4.8, which as of this taping is the latest official version of the .NET Framework. If you have, there's a feature we'll see in just a minute called Polybase, and if you select that, you're also going to need the Java runtime. We did not select that, so we don't need that. And then you're going to need this thing called the Visual C++ redistribution pack, and don't worry what that means. The machine basically looks at it and goes, I see what you need, and I'll fix it for you. Okay, so most of the time when you do one of these installers, it's one of those web installers where you click on it and you're connected to the internet, and it'll go download whatever the heck it's missing. Okay, that's the way it works. In other words, it's not, everything is not included. You could tell that from the size of the exe file for the installer. I mean, it's pretty small. Now there's an alternative. When you launch that guy, one of the options we installed way back when, there was 3 options. You had basic, we had custom, and then there was a download section. If you hit download, it'll actually pull down all of the ISO files, so you could do an unattached. That's probably not a good choice of words, but you could do an install without having the internet. So it pulls everything down at one time, and then you've got it. So yes, you can download an ISO file that contains the entire installation media. Okay, so when you do the install, there's some choices. It comes up and says, hey, would you like the SQL Server database engine? Well, yeah, that's the thing that we're installing. So clearly we're going to have to do this. Analytical services. So this is online analytical processing, and it's pretty cool, but we're not doing that in this course. Reporting services. Again, this used to be something where you would produce paper copies of stuff, but now basically its default output is a web page. Isn't that pretty cool? Integration services. This is for like transforming data from other systems. Maybe you have an older system, or instead of like just stealing all the data from your Oracle system to put in yours, why don't you just hook up a bridge, so you don't have to take it from one and put it in the other. They can live simultaneously and just pass data back and forth. That's what integration services. Okay. Master data services for doing management. Machine learning. Okay, we're getting way out there. But this is the big data stuff. There's an entire language called R. That's the name of it. And it'll allow you to actually write some applications, so to speak, that does big data. And then Polybase, which is like a super duper version of like Excel, kind of, sort of. It can do all sorts of interesting things. So we're not doing any of that. The only thing we're installing is a database engine. Okay, so I'm going to pretend like we're going to do an install. I've already got it installed, but I'm going to pretend. So I'm going to go here to Microsoft SQL Server and go to the Installation Center. Okay, so let's just go through the list here. The planning section, okay, that's pretty boring. I mean, it's good reading, don't get me wrong. If you've never done this before in your entire life, maybe you ought to go through and look at all this stuff. But just for lack of time, I'm going to move on. So I'm going to go to the Installation tab over here, which is where the things happen. Now let's just stop and think. The first one is a new server instance. Now it doesn't actually use the word instance, but just pay attention. New server standalone installation, or add features to an existing one, which is what we have since I already have it installed. Okay, kind of sort of makes sense. And then installing reporting services, installing management tools, installing the data tools, all these other kinds of things. Okay, so we obviously are going to be the one doing the add and remove from existing installation. All right, so hang on. So what is this thing that keeps talking about, like new server failover cluster and add a node to a failover cluster? By the way, these are grayed out because we're running the wimpy version, but just bear with me for a minute. So what is a cluster? So basically what that means is I could have 2 different servers, physical servers, and then have part of the database over here and part of the database over here, and they act as if they're just one database. So I can have an instance on server A and an instance on server B, and they all talk to each other. Okay? Now, having said that, can I install another copy of SQL Server on the machine we have right now? Yeah, I can. Now that's kind of weird, because think about this. Let's say you had Microsoft Word installed on your computer, and I asked, can you install another copy of Microsoft Word of the same version? What would happen? The machine would go, what are you doing? You've already got this installed. Why on earth would you want to do it a second time? So that's kind of weird, huh? SQL Server will allow you to install it a second time. All you have to do is just give it a different instance name. Now, so yes, you can install it on the same machine. Normally in a cluster environment, you wouldn't put it on the same machine because what you're trying to do is spread the load. So it make more sense to put it in another physical server. But that's not really the point here. Okay, so I have a new diagram here. And this is the new information pyramid. We started this information pyramid way back when, and we started with database. And we said, A single database can have multiple tables, and a table can have multiple rows. Okay, we may have actually gone through and said a row can have multiple columns, but now we have a server instance. So a server instance could have multiple databases. We have that, right? This is one server instance, and look at all the databases we got, right? We got lots of databases. And so now the new one has this thing on top, which is a cluster. A cluster can have multiple instances, multiple data. So a single cluster can have multiple instances. Single instance can have multiple database. Single database can have multiple tables. Single table has multiple rows. Okay, good. All right. Okay, let's do an install. So I'm doing this first one. And it says, okay, there are no updates. Fine, that's great. Let's hit next. It's going to look at all the things that need to be done. And the only thing it finds a problem with is the Windows firewall. And we're not going to mess with that because, quite frankly, we've configured our Express Edition to not use a network at all. So we don't need a firewall exception. So we're cool. I'm going to move on. And then I perform a new installation or add features to an existing one. I'm gonna stick with that for the time being. And then accept the license agreement. And then what features do you want? And so it picked a bunch of features for me, but the database engine is the most critical one. That's where it actually does things. Do I want replication? So I want to replicate between my server and somebody else's server. Machine learning, the R, Python, and Java languages that allow you to do some big data stuff. Full text searching. Right now we can do a search, but if I said, I don't know, the difference between plural and singular words, the full text search can actually go in and say, well, I know you said that, but here's a similar match, those kind of things. Polybase and a bunch of others. Hey, just to make things easy, I'm going to turn all this stuff off. Okay. In fact, I'm going to turn, just to make this demo go a lot quicker. Okay, so here we are. I selected the pieces that I want. Cool. Let's hit next. And then it's going to come up and talk about I'm going to call this one special. Okay. And then server accounts, I'm just going to hit the next. This is going to tell you, how's it going to start? Is it automatically going to start when I start the machine? And what accounts am I going to use? I'm going to use the same accounts that it decides. This one is kind of weird. Here's where you pick at the very beginning whether or not you want to use the Windows authentication mode, or you want to also have a combination of SQL Server authentication and Windows authentication. Okay, if you pick this, you're going to have to specify a password in here. Okay, so we left it at this. That way, first of all, I don't want to have to learn another password. Okay, not another username and not another password. So I'm going to leave it just the way it is. You could click through some of these other things. This is kind of cool, is that whenever you do the install, whoever does the install typically is put in the server administration role. And if you hit the little button that says add user, it adds you in there. And then it's basically going to come up and say, okay, I think we've got it all ready. Are you ready? It's going to go through and say, okay, I think I'm about ready to start. I'm going to hit cancel here because I don't really want to do that. Okay, so that's basically in a nutshell. Oh, it's still running. Thank you. So that's it in a nutshell on how you do the install. What pieces are that you have to pick. So one more time, let's talk about the instances. So I was in the process of installing a new instance. So I would have two instances on my same machine. I'll admit that's a bit weird. Once again, you can't do that with practically any other Microsoft product, but you can with SQL Server. Okay, this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up again in just a few.